Before anyone called him a god, he broke an agreement that had never been broken. The pact held realms together, sworn by powers older than memory. He violated it without urgency, without fear, almost casually. The damage was immediate. Borders shifted. Alliances froze. What shocked everyone was not the betrayal itself, but the fact that he was not destroyed for it. Instead, he was allowed to remain. And from that moment on, nothing truly felt secure again. They debated ending him that same night. Some demanded it, others hesitated. He had crossed a line that defined order itself. Yet his act had also prevented a larger collapse, one no one else had seen in time. The truth unsettled them. He was dangerous, but useful. Punishing him meant admitting they needed him less than they feared. Letting him stay meant accepting a new risk. They chose the risk, and that choice followed them for years. After that night, he did not slow down. He tested limits deliberately. Promises were bent, oaths rewritten through loopholes only he seemed able to find. When confronted, he never denied what he had done. He explained why it worked. Each time, the outcome favored them in the short term. Each time, the cost arrived later, heavier. They began to realize something uncomfortable. He was not making mistakes. He was teaching them a different way to survive. They learned quickly that asking how he did it only made things worse. Questions led to answers no one wanted to hear, so an unspoken agreement formed. He would fix what others could not, and they would look away from the methods. Victories came faster this way, cleaner. Yet every success carried a faint sense of imbalance, as if the solution had solved the moment while quietly damaging whatever came next. Each time he helped, something subtle failed to line up afterward. A detail went unexplained. A consequence was postponed. A rule still stood, but felt thinner than before. No one could point to a single mistake, which made the damage easier to ignore. The immediate crisis was gone, and that was enough. Over time, they stopped asking whether the victory was clean. They only cared that it arrived before everything collapsed. It was not trust that kept him close. It was usefulness. As long as he could do what no one else would, his presence was tolerated. His flaws were renamed quirks, his lies reframed as cleverness. The line between necessity and dependence blurred quietly. They told themselves they were still in control, that he was only a tool, but tools that solve everything eventually decide where they are used. The first time he openly deceived another god, it was done in public. He redirected blame, altered witnesses, and walked away untouched. The deception held. Order remained. That was the moment tolerance shifted. What had been clever became alarming. If he could mislead one of them and suffer no consequence, then every agreement was vulnerable. Fear did not come from what he did next, but from realizing how easily it had worked. After that deception, others began to imitate him. Small lies replaced direct answers. Clever framing softened hard truths. He watched this happen without intervening. When questioned, he only pointed out that nothing he had done was impossible before him. He had simply proved it could be done. What spread was not rebellion, but permission. And permission, once granted, is far harder to contain than defiance. The damage did not appear as chaos. It appeared as doubt. Agreement still held, but only after being questioned. Words required clarification. Trust demanded proof. What once moved smoothly now stalled under suspicion. His actions had not shattered order outright. They had weakened its certainty. And certainty once lost does not return easily. They began to understand that what he had broken could not be repaired with punishment alone. That was how he became embedded among them. Not as a hero and not yet as an enemy. He existed in the space between, where results mattered more than intent. He solved too much to be dismissed and bent too many rules to be fully trusted. By the time anyone considered removing him, they realized something uncomfortable. They no longer remembered how to survive their problems without him. The shift was subtle at first. Problems stopped being prevented and started being managed. Instead of strengthening what held them together, they waited for failure and trusted that he would handle it when it arrived. This changed the rhythm of everything. Urgency replaced foresight. Reaction replaced preparation. He was no longer a last resort. He had become part of the process, quietly reshaping how decisions were made long before anyone noticed the cost. As reliance grew, so did the distance between action and responsibility. When a choice went wrong, no one felt directly accountable. The logic was simple and dangerous. He had handled worse before. He would handle this too. Over time, decisions became lighter, almost careless because the consequences no longer felt immediate. The safety he provided was not protection, it was delay. And delay, when mistaken for control, quietly trains people to stop taking responsibility at all. His presence began to shape decisions even when he was not involved. Plans were made with failure already accounted for, because failure no longer felt final. Risk stopped being avoided and became something scheduled, almost routine. This shift passed as confidence, but it was something else entirely. Confidence built on rescue rather than stability is fragile. It survives only while someone remains willing, present, and capable of fixing what others no longer bother to prevent. The price arrived when he saved an enemy they had agreed to destroy. He did it quietly, altering timing, misdirecting pursuit, and sealing the escape himself. The enemy survived. A war was delayed. When confronted, he argued the outcome favored them. Fewer losses, more leverage. The logic was flawless, the act was unforgivable. From that moment on, they no longer debated whether he was dangerous. They debated whether they could afford to lose him. That decision fractured something permanent. Some called it betrayal. Others called it strategy. No one called it justice. He accepted none of the accusations. He did not apologize, nor did he celebrate. He only reminded them that the war they wanted would have cost more than they were willing to admit. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. From then on, every victory carried his shadow, and every loss carried his name. After that, his actions stopped being judged individually. They were weighed for their long-term impact. Every choice he made carried uncertainty. Every solution came with an invisible cost. He was still allowed to act, but never without suspicion. What unsettled them most was not that he caused damage, but that he was often right. Each time his logic proved sound, it became harder to argue against him, and easier to fear what he might justify next. Attempts were made to pull back, quietly at first. Fewer requests, more caution. But the damage was already done. Systems that adapt around a single solution struggle when that solution is withheld. Small failures began to pile up. Fixes that once came easily now required negotiation. What had been flexible hardened. In trying to regain control, they discovered how much of it they had already surrendered without realizing it. What unsettled them most was not the failures themselves, but how ordinary they had become. Breakdowns no longer caused alarm, only irritation. The expectation had shifted. Problems were assumed, not feared. This normalization masked the danger. When failure becomes routine, warning signs lose their power. The system continues moving forward, unaware that what it calls resilience is actually exhaustion disguised as stability. It was in this environment that his role quietly changed again. He was no longer just fixing outcomes, he was shaping expectations. Decisions were made assuming his intervention would smooth the consequences later. This removed urgency, but it also removed care. When effort disappears from preparation, it resurfaces as damage elsewhere. What they gained in short-term relief, they lost in long-term coherence, even if they did not yet know how to name it. By then, removing him no longer felt like an option. It felt like a risk no one wanted to take responsibility for. The system had grown accustomed to bending instead of reinforcing itself. What once looked like control now resembled avoidance. And beneath the surface, a quiet truth settled in. They were no longer choosing him because he was the best solution. They were choosing him because they could no longer imagine what would happen without him. That dependence created a dangerous illusion of calm. As long as he remained present, nothing seemed truly out of control. Tension existed, but it felt managed, contained by his readiness to intervene. This calm was deceptive. It was not balance, but suspension. Every unresolved cost was being carried forward, unseen, accumulating weight. The longer this lasted, the harder it became to tell whether stability still existed or if everything was simply being held in place by habit. Some began to notice the pattern too late. Whenever order held, his influence was nearby. Whenever it failed, his absence was blamed. This reversal was subtle but decisive. Responsibility no longer pointed to decisions or structures, but to proximity. He was no longer judged by what he caused, but by whether he was present when things went wrong. In that shift, cause and consequence quietly traded places, and truth became harder to trace. As stories spread, his actions began to be retold out of order. Results came first, methods faded, motives disappeared entirely. What remained were outcomes that seemed impossible without interference. This distortion worked in his favor. When events are remembered without context, responsibility becomes optional. People argued about what happened, not how it was allowed to happen. And in that confusion, the line between influence and blame grew thinner with every retelling. The shift became undeniable when they realized they were planning around him. Councils delayed decisions until he arrived. Risks were accepted because he could twist outcomes later. What frightened them was not his presence, but their dependence on it. He had not demanded authority, he had earned it through results, and authority gained that way is the hardest to revoke, because removing it feels like choosing vulnerability on purpose. Fear changed how they spoke to him. Questions became careful, accusations softened into requests. He noticed immediately. Where authority hesitates, leverage grows. He did not exploit it openly. He let it exist. The knowledge that he could redirect events if pushed became enough. From that moment on, restraint stopped being a rule and became a negotiation, and negotiations with someone like him never end cleanly. The first true attempt to limit him came disguised as reform. New rules, clearer boundaries, shared oversight. On the surface, it looked like balance. In practice, every restriction relied on his cooperation. He followed each rule precisely, exposing its gaps without breaking it. What was meant to contain him instead revealed how fragile their authority had become. Control that depends on compliance is never control at all. It was during this phase that his presence began to feel unavoidable, not because he forced himself forward, but because everything now moved in relation to him. Plans adjusted around his involvement. Risks were measured by whether he could contain them. Even opposition depended on his reaction. What once felt like influence had become gravity. And when gravity takes hold, escape no longer looks like resistance, but collapse. The first open fractures appeared soon after. Not in the structure itself, but in trust. Alliances weakened, promises required clarification, words once taken at face value demanded proof. His methods had trained them to expect hidden angles, and that expectation spread. Suspicion replaced confidence. Coordination slowed. Even honest decisions were questioned because the system had learned, through him, that outcomes rarely meant what they seemed at first. As trust eroded, reactions grew sharper. Every unexpected result was now examined for hidden intent. Every success carried suspicion. What had once been adaptability became paranoia. The system no longer responded to reality as it was, but to what it feared might be concealed within it. In trying to protect itself from manipulation, it adopted the very logic it once attributed only to him. By the time this shift became visible, it was already embedded. The system no longer failed loudly. It failed quietly, through hesitation, mistrust, and constant second-guessing. Decisions slowed. Action fractured. What had once been flexibility now resembled paralysis. And at the center of it all was a realization no one wanted to name yet. They had learned how to think like him, and in doing so, they had changed themselves beyond recognition. That realization brought fear, but not clarity. Knowing something was wrong did not explain how to reverse it. Every attempt to restore trust exposed how deeply suspicion had settled in. The habits they had learned were now reflexes. Even when he remained silent, his influence shaped responses. They reacted to possibilities rather than facts, preparing for manipulation even when none was present. In trying to protect themselves from him, they had absorbed his logic as their own. This internal shift created a new kind of instability. Not chaos, but erosion. Cooperation became conditional. Every agreement included silent contingencies. The cost of acting rose because certainty no longer existed. What once required trust now demanded verification, and verification demanded time. Momentum slowed, opportunities passed. The system did not collapse outwardly. It weakened inwardly, burdened by a mindset that questioned everything and committed to nothing. It was at this point that his presence began to feel less like assistance and more like a shadow. Even when he was absent, decisions were shaped by what he might do. Silence became suspicious. Simplicity felt dangerous. The system no longer trusted outcomes that arrived cleanly. It expected twists, reversals, hidden costs. What had once been intelligence now operated as reflex, and reflex, when left unchecked, quietly replaces judgment. The breaking point came when he acted without asking anyone. He altered an outcome already decided, reshaped it in silence, and presented the result as unavoidable. The decision worked. The cost was undeniable. For the first time, they saw what it meant to live in a world where his judgment could override theirs entirely. From that moment on, fear was no longer about what he might do next. It was about what he had already proven he could do alone. That act forced a decision they had postponed for too long. Allowing him to continue meant surrendering authority entirely. Stopping him meant facing the instability he had been containing. There was no clean option left. The delay had erased it. What followed was not justice, but necessity. They moved against him not because they were certain, but because uncertainty had finally become more dangerous than action. They did not strike openly. They moved through restraint, accusation, and delay, hoping pressure would force compliance. He did not resist. He answered every charge with precision, every demand with logic. Each response weakened their position further. What was meant to corner him exposed how unprepared they were to confront someone who understood their rules better than they did. In trying to contain him, they revealed how much control they had already lost. The attempt to restrain him exposed how fragile authority had become. Rules were invoked that no longer carried weight. Justifications sounded hollow even to those repeating them. He did not resist openly. He listened. He waited. That was what unsettled them most. A system confident in its power does not fear patience. What they saw instead was their own hesitation reflected back at them, and the realization that control, once delayed too long, is rarely reclaimed intact. In restraining him, they revealed more than they intended. The process was improvised, layered with exceptions and justifications meant to soften its impact. Nothing about it felt final. Authority hesitated, negotiated with itself, and called that restraint. The act was meant to reassert control, yet it exposed how conditional that control had become. What should have been decisive instead felt provisional, as if everyone involved understood this was not an ending, only a pause. That pause changed everything. With him contained, the system expected relief. Instead, it faced silence without resolution. Problems still emerged, but now without a familiar mechanism to absorb them. Decisions felt heavier. Responsibility returned abruptly, without practice. What had been postponed for years demanded immediate reckoning. In restraining him, they had not restored balance. They had removed the distraction that kept them from noticing how unprepared they had become. Only then did they begin to understand the scale of what had been deferred. Systems built on correction, rather than prevention, struggle when correction disappears. Processes failed not because they were attacked, but because they had never been reinforced. What had felt like stability was revealed as constant adjustment. With him removed, the weight of every unresolved compromise surfaced at once, exposing how long balance had depended on something never meant to carry it alone. As the weight surfaced, fear shifted direction. It was no longer centered on him, but on what his absence revealed. Structures that once felt dependable now required constant attention. Every decision exposed gaps that had been covered for years. What unsettled them most was the realization that the damage was not recent. It had been accumulating quietly, hidden behind solutions that worked just long enough to delay accountability. With him restrained, explanations began to shift. Failures were no longer framed as isolated events, but as symptoms of something deeper. Patterns emerged that could no longer be ignored. Decisions once justified by urgency now looked careless in hindsight. The question was no longer whether his influence had caused damage, but how much of that damage had been willingly accepted because confronting it earlier felt inconvenient, risky, or unnecessary. As those patterns became undeniable, memory itself began to shift. Past decisions were revisited with new suspicion. Moments once celebrated as victories now felt compromised. What had been praised as cleverness looked increasingly like avoidance. The narrative started to fracture, not because the past had changed, but because the meaning assigned to it could no longer hold. What unsettled them most was realizing that the story they told themselves had protected them from seeing the truth. This fracture forced an uncomfortable reckoning. Responsibility could no longer be assigned to a single figure or moment. It spread backward through years of decisions made easier by delay. Each compromise pointed to another, forming a chain no one wanted to trace to its origin. What they faced was not the consequence of deception alone, but the cumulative weight of choices made, while trusting that someone else would always manage the cost. In that reckoning, his role grew more complex rather than clearer. He had exploited weaknesses, yes, but those weaknesses had existed long before he ever touched them. The system had invited correction instead of change, cleverness instead of strength. What unsettled them was the realization that removing him did not restore what was lost. It only revealed how much had been surrendered willingly, piece by piece, while everything still seemed to function. The punishment was designed to remove him without destroying what he still held together. Exile, confinement, distance, not death, not silence. They chose separation over execution, fearing what might break if he vanished completely. He accepted the sentence without protest. What unsettled them was how prepared he seemed. As he was taken away, it became clear that removing him did not restore order. It only exposed how much order had depended on his interference. With him removed, the fractures spread faster. Decisions stalled. Conflicts resurfaced without containment. What he had delayed returned at once, demanding payment. Some began to question whether the punishment had come too late. Others feared it had come too soon. His absence did not bring clarity. It brought exposure. For the first time, they faced the full cost of the choices he had absorbed for them, and none of them were prepared to carry it alone. Only then did they understand the depth of what he had controlled. Conflicts he had postponed ignited. Enemies he had manipulated resurfaced. The balance they believed was natural had been engineered. His removal did not end the chaos. It released it. What terrified them most was not that he had caused this instability, but that he had been the one containing it, choosing when and how the damage would arrive. As responsibility returned, so did fear. Not fear of collapse, but fear of exposure. Every decision now revealed who was accountable and who was not. There were no more places to hide intent behind clever outcomes. The system had to confront itself honestly, without intermediaries. What unsettled them most was realizing how long they had avoided this moment and how much easier it had been to live inside ambiguity than to face clarity head-on. Only then did his absence begin to feel permanent, not as punishment but as consequence. The system adjusted slowly, without shortcuts, without clever detours. What emerged was weaker but honest, less efficient but real. In removing him, they had not restored what was lost. They had forced themselves to live with the truth of what remained, and that truth was harder to manage than any deception he had ever offered. Even so, the story did not end with his removal. Absence does not erase influence. Patterns linger longer than people. Decisions were still shaped by habits formed in his presence. Shortcuts were avoided consciously, yet the impulse to reach for them remained. What they were dismantling was not a figure, but a way of thinking that had embedded itself deeply. And ways of thinking, once normalized, resist disappearance far more stubbornly than individuals ever do. That lingering influence revealed itself in moments of hesitation. Faced with uncertainty, some still waited for a solution that would never come. The habit of deferring responsibility had not vanished with him. It surfaced in delays, in overanalysis, in the quiet hope that complexity might resolve itself. What they confronted was not his legacy as a presence, but his legacy as a pattern, one that had taught them to expect relief instead of resilience. Only gradually did they accept that no final correction was coming. There would be no moment of balance restored, no return to what existed before. What had been altered could not be reversed, only understood. The cost of dependence was not collapse, but permanence. Choices made under delay had reshaped the system itself. What remained was not a wound to heal, but a condition to live with, learned too late and paid in full. That permanence forced a final shift in perspective. What had once been framed as disruption was now understood as exposure. He had not introduced instability into a stable world. He had revealed how unstable it already was. This reframing did not absolve him, but it removed the comfort of simple blame. Responsibility widened, stretching across every decision that had chosen speed over care and relief over repair. With that understanding, the narrative surrounding him began to change. He was no longer spoken of only as a threat or a failure, but as a measure of what had been tolerated. His actions became reference points, not excuses. Each retelling carried less judgment and more caution. The question shifted from what he had done to why so many had accepted it for so long, knowing the cost would eventually be unavoidable. In time, his story stopped being used to explain collapse and started being used to warn against repetition. Not because it offered comfort, but because it exposed a pattern too familiar to ignore. Whenever convenience replaced responsibility, whenever clever fixes postponed real change, the same conditions resurfaced. His name lingered not as a cause, but as a reminder of how easily systems choose delay when facing the cost of doing things right. What unsettled later generations was not the memory of his actions, but the familiarity of the conditions that allowed them. Each time a system leaned too heavily on improvisation, his story resurfaced. Each time shortcuts were praised over structure, the pattern repeated. His presence was no longer required. The lesson had detached from the figure and embedded itself into behavior, quietly influencing choices without needing a name to justify them. This is why his story never fully closes. It does not end with punishment, redemption, or resolution. It lingers because it mirrors decisions people continue to make. The danger was never confined to a single figure. It lived in the willingness to accept solutions that worked immediately while quietly transferring their cost forward. As long as that instinct survives, his shadow does too. In the end, what remained was not a warning about deceit, but about tolerance. The system had not been destroyed by a single act, but shaped by countless small decisions that favored ease over integrity. His influence faded, but the habits it created endured. What people feared most was not his return, but the recognition that they no longer needed him to repeat the same mistakes. That recognition marked the true ending of his presence. Not exile, not silence, but irrelevance. He was no longer required to expose weakness, because weakness had become self-evident. The system carried forward on habits it had learned too well, repeating patterns without prompting. His role concluded not with finality but with absorption. What he had once embodied was now distributed everywhere, indistinguishable from ordinary behavior. From that point on, his name survived more as a reference than a presence. It was invoked when patterns repeated, when systems drifted toward convenience again. Not as an accusation, but as recognition, a shorthand for a familiar failure. His story endured because it described something structural, not personal. What happened once could happen again, anywhere conditions favored delay over discipline and cleverness over accountability. This endurance explains why his legend resists simplification. Attempts to reduce it to morality or intent always fall short. The story survives because it captures a process, not a personality. It shows how intelligence can be mistaken for solution, how adaptability can replace responsibility, and how systems often choose what works now over what will last later, even when they understand the risk involved. Over time, the legend hardened into warning rather than explanation. It was no longer about what he did, but about what others allowed. Each retelling stripped away details and sharpened the lesson. Systems rarely fail because of a single disruptive force. They fail because they normalize compromise until compromise becomes design. His story endured because it named that moment when tolerance quietly replaced responsibility, and no one noticed until reversal was no longer possible. What made his story unsettling was its familiarity. Nothing about it required extraordinary power or divine malice. It unfolded through ordinary choices, repeated often enough to reshape reality. Each delay felt reasonable. Each compromise felt temporary. Taken alone, none seemed catastrophic. Together, they formed a path that could not be easily abandoned. His legend survived because it exposed how collapse often begins quietly, disguised as practicality and justified as necessity. By the final stage, no illusion remained to protect. The system still functioned, but without ease, without clever detours, and without anyone to absorb blame. Every decision now carried visible weight. Every failure demanded ownership. What remained was slower, more fragile, but exposed. The comfort of deflection was gone. What they faced was not collapse, but the cost of having postponed responsibility until it could no longer be avoided. This exposure reshaped how failure was understood. Without a figure to absorb tension, mistakes could no longer be reframed as clever risks or necessary compromises. They stood plainly as decisions made under pressure. The system learned painfully that clarity offers no comfort. It demands endurance. What once felt unbearable was not difficulty itself, but the loss of excuses that had softened the weight of consequence for so long. In that clarity, his story finally settled into its true form. Not as a tale of deception, but as a record of tolerance stretched too far. He had not forced his way into influence. He had been invited repeatedly, each time because the alternative felt harder. What endured was the understanding that systems rarely fall from attack alone. They fail when convenience is chosen often enough to become identity. His story changed once distance replaced fear. Deeds were retold without the urgency that had once surrounded them. Betrayals became tactics, deceptions became intelligence. What had been condemned began to sound necessary in hindsight. Time did not soften what he did, but it reframed it. The more they tried to explain the chaos that followed his exile, the more his actions began to resemble intention rather than impulse. In time, his name was no longer spoken as accusation, but as explanation. When agreements failed unexpectedly, someone would mention him. When plans collapsed despite careful design, his influence was suspected. He became a reference point for everything that worked too well before turning dangerous. Not a monster, not a hero, a reminder that intelligence without restraint leaves scars that survive long after the individual is gone. That is how he became more than a figure. His story survived because it explained what others preferred not to face. He was remembered not for what he destroyed, but for what he revealed. How easily order bends when results matter more than rules. How often chaos is tolerated when it is useful. His name endured because forgetting it would require admitting how much of the damage had been willingly accepted.